Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is Community Solar Program Design and Implementation for Low and Moderate Income Customers. This webinar is being presented by the Clean Energy States Alliance, also known as CESA, and we have a few excellent guest speakers on the line with us today from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, also known as NREL. Before I pass it over to them for our presentation, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. All of our attendees on the line are in listen-only mode. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of the webinar. You can connect using your computer mic and speakers, or you can use your telephone and the dial-in information that's provided. If you'd like to minimize the webinar console so that you can view the presentation full screen, click on the little orange arrow that you see circled here, and that arrow is also helpful for expanding the webinar console. A very important note, we ask that you please submit your questions and your comments throughout the webinar by typing them into the question box on your webinar console and hitting send. We will be reading through your questions as they come in throughout the webinar, and we're going to save at least 15 minutes at the end of our webinar for a Q&A with the audience. We do have a lot of people registered for this webinar, so that should mean a lot of questions. To make sure that we get to your question, type it in when you think of it. Don't wait until the very end to submit your question. A final note, this webinar is being recorded. We will send you an email probably this afternoon, at least within 48 hours, with a link to the webinar slides and the recording. And we'll also be posting those materials on our website. You can find that at cesa.org/webinars, or also at that web address you can find all of our previous webinars and information about upcoming webinars. So with that, I'd like to pass it over to our host for this webinar, Diana Chase. Diana is a project director here at the Clean Energy States Alliance, and she is going to get us started.
Thank you, Samantha. As Sam said, I'm Diana Chase, and I'm a project director here at the Clean Energy States Alliance, or CESA. We're here today to talk about community solar program design and implementation for low and moderate income customers. But first, let me just briefly introduce you to CESA. We're a coalition of public energy agencies, mostly state agencies from around the country, working together to advance clean energy. You can see our members here. Our webinar today is funded under a grant from the U.S. Department of Energy. Through this grant, CESA is working with 5 states, Connecticut, Minnesota, New Mexico, Oregon, and Rhode Island, plus the District of Columbia, to develop and implement policies to make solar more accessible to low and moderate income residents. Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory and the National Renewable Energy Laboratory are providing research support. Today's webinar features Jenny Heeter and Lori Bird from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. Jenny and Laurie will discuss their forthcoming report, Design and Implementation of Community Solar Programs for Low and Moderate Income Customers. The report reviews existing and emerging LMI community solar programs, discusses key questions related to program design, outlines how states can leverage incentives and finance structures to lower the cost of LMI community solar, and examines marketing and outreach considerations. I'd like to introduce our speakers now. Jenny Heeter is a senior energy analyst at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Golden, Colorado. She focuses her research on corporate purchases of renewable energy and the mid-scale solar market. In 2017, she began leading a program that trains cities across the country to put solar on their facilities. She holds an MPA in Environmental Policy from Indiana University Bloomington's School of Public and Environmental Affairs, and a BA in Environmental Studies and Political Science from Macalester College. Laurie Bird is a principal analyst in the Markets and Policy Group at NREL. She is currently leading work examining distributed solar barriers in the western states and assisting with state strategies for PV adoption among low-income customers. Recently, she helped launch the new DOE Solar Energy Innovation Network, which is designed to foster innovative solutions to solar market barriers. She holds a master's degree in environmental studies from Yale University's School of Forestry and Environmental Studies and lives in a house with solar PV in Boulder, Colorado with her husband and 2 children. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jenny and Laurie.
Great. So this is Laurie Bird. I'm going to kick it off and then turn it over to Jenny to really do the substance of the slides. But I just wanted to introduce the project overall that we've been working with CISA on and the 6 states. So we've been providing research support to these states that are thinking about solar strategies for providing access to low-income customers, so enabling them to have access to solar. So we've done a couple of different, prepared a couple of different resources as part of that. What we're discussing here today is one of those that's focused on community solar design and implementation. We did another paper earlier that was released a few months ago called Unlocking Solar for Low and Moderate Income Residents that focused more on financing options and how those can vary depending on housing type and some things about residential access to solar. So we explore some of those issues there, things about HUD housing and those incentives and how they pertain to financing strategies and things. So that might be of interest to folks. That's available online. And we've done some other work that's not fully published yet that will be forthcoming soon that does some modeling using the community solar business case tool to look at the financials of community solar for low-income customers and how that can vary across states and different scenarios of providing incentives to those customers. So I just wanted you to be aware of those things that are forthcoming. So today's webinar, we're going to focus, again, we're talking about community solar design and implementation issues in some detail. So overall, the structure of what we're going to talk about here is providing some overview of the existing state community solar LMI programs. We've seen a lot of growth in that area. Many states are rolling out requirements for low-income customers to be included in community solar. So we'll give a bit of an update there. And then we'll walk through program design considerations, the incentives and financing strategies, and briefly some issues around customer outreach. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Jenny Heeter. She can take it from here.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I wanted to just start with an overview of a couple state LMI community solar programs. As Laurie mentioned, a lot of states are starting to get interested in this space, and so this map is evolving over time, but I think it's up to date as of yesterday or so. We see that we have 12 states and DC that have some type of policy or program support for LMI community solar. The states in red there are ones that have some sort of legislation or program in place, but the actual rules are still being fleshed out. The other buckets we have, the sort of yellow tan bucket is a carve out, so that's where the state has decided that a certain percentage or a certain number of megawatts of a community solar program should be devoted to low income or low to moderate income subscribers. An example of that is in Oregon, they have a 10% rule for LMI participation. The other structure we highlight is some type of incentive. So these incentives can be, grant programs from the state, or in Rhode Island, they have an incentive that is basically a bonus for signing up an LMI subscriber. So it's a $200 bonus that goes to the developer if they sign on that low or moderate income subscriber. The other policy we focus on here is multifamily incentives. We don't tend to focus on that throughout the report, but thought it was helpful just to note them on the map that California had its MASH program, the Multifamily Affordable Solar Housing Program, which provided incentives to affordable housing developments. And DC has also focused on multifamily housing as well. So that's where things are at just across the country. There is more detail in the report that will be coming out, but hopefully that gives you a good overview of the types of programs that we're tracking and some of the key variations. I wanted to back up a little bit and just talk about, why do we need to have low income or low to moderate income community solar programs? This table presents just a sample of community solar offerings across the country. And what you see is that there is some variation in terms of how the products are structured, as well as the estimated payback periods. So some programs are structured as a monthly payment that's ongoing, while others require sometimes a substantial upfront cost. So we know that that upfront cost piece can be challenging for LMI customers, and also if there's a long payback period, that may not be financially attractive enough for those types of customers. So we do see in Massachusetts and Minnesota, a couple projects are offering savings, immediate savings on day one. So for those types of products, there may be less need for LMI carve-outs or incentives. In other states, Washington, Colorado, New York, Wisconsin, we've seen more of that upfront cost model where a subscriber would be paying, dollars per watt upfront, and then waiting to get bill credits to recoup their costs. So the estimated payback for those programs is about 7 to 12 years, which is quite long. So throughout the report and throughout this presentation, I wanted to walk through a couple of program design options. There are a lot of different ways that these programs are being implemented, and while we present, unique options here, we do want to note that most programs are combining multiple elements within their program design. So the first one I wanted to go into more detail on was the LMI carve-out. So that's where a fraction of the project's capacity or generation is going to LMI customers. In the states that currently have this structure or have planned this structure, carve-outs are usually around 5 to 20%, but we have seen some higher ones as well. In Hawaii, they've proposed 50%. So really up to the state to determine what that percentage might look like. In Maryland, they've structured their participation as a set-aside on a megawatt basis. So they have 60 megawatts set aside out of 193 total community solar megawatts that will be devoted to LMI specifically. And for each of these options, I wanted to just highlight a few advantages and disadvantages of the design, and these are really specific to this component in particular, but there may be considerations as well if you're combining this with a different type of program element. So key advantages for this carve-out is that it does ensure a minimum level of participation by LMI subscribers. In contrast, if you just have an incentive program, it may be that nobody actually uses that incentive, so you won't actually see a known level of LMI participation. Under this structure, you also are allowing non-LMI customers participate. That can help keep the cost lower for those LMI customers if the non-LMI folks are maybe paying a slightly higher rate, and the LMI customers can pay a slightly lower rate. You also allow a wide range of customers, so commercial customers that might be, purchasing a larger share. That can help drive down costs for everyone. And the broader mix of customers could also reduce default risk, which we'll talk about a little bit later as well. Some of the challenges to this structure is that if there is a set threshold for LMI participation, like 5%, it can be hard for the developer to always maintain that level. So they may need to have, a backup list of potential subscribers and just really monitoring that level carefully. And then a disadvantage, although non-LMI customers could pay higher rates to subsidize those LMI customers, that's obviously a disadvantage to those folks that are paying higher rates. The next scenario I wanted to walk through was an LMI-only project or program. So in contrast to the previous example, this is where you are just having an array that is exclusively subscribed by LMI customers. An example of this is some projects that the Colorado Energy Office funded. They looked at a variety of different structures, but they were all focused on arrays that are dedicated to LMI customers. So under this structure, there are some advantages. You could find ways to more easily draw on existing customer programs that are targeted towards LMI. You can also target your marketing materials, and you may have just more dedicated focus on that LMI participation. Some of the challenges with this are pretty much on the financial side, so it can be harder to have LMI customers support all of the costs for the community solar program. You're not going to have the non-LMI or anchor tenants who could potentially absorb some of those costs. It's also limiting to those other folks. So if there's just a utility has a program just for LMI customers, its other customers may say, hey, we want to have a community solar program too. So there could be some fairness or lack of access there as well. And then for third-party developers, there may be some higher financial risk if all the customers are LMI customers. So the next thing to focus on is the anchor tenant. And as I mentioned, this is something that could be combined with a carve-out or another structure. But the basic concept of an anchor tenant is that they're a single, usually a non-residential commercial customer who's taking a large share of the project's capacity. And typically, community solar programs will have some sort of cap on how much one anchor tenant could take of the project's capacity. In Hawaii, they've proposed that that anchor could take up to 60% of one project's capacity. So what this does is, if you do have that anchor tenant that can take a large share of the project, it can improve project economics. It helps the developers obtain their financing. They also have lower risk associated with customer churn because they do have that commitment from one large customer. We'll talk about flexible anchor tenant agreements a little bit later, but essentially there's some wiggle room, right, for anchor tenants. They may say, we'll take anywhere between 45 and 50% of the output of the array, and if it needs to be 50% one month and 45% the other month, that's fine. So having an anchor with a little bit of flexibility can help with that customer turnover risk. And finally, on the advantages, some of the anchor tenants may be able to provide land or rooftop space for the array and may build that into their subscription and get some compensation for that. But in areas that are land constrained or rooftop constrained, that could be a nice benefit. Disadvantages, if you have a large anchor tenant, you are going to reduce the number of LMI subscribers. That is why typically states will have caps on how much the anchor tenant could take of the project. And then lastly, the anchor tenant does assume more risk by taking that larger share of the project. So next up, I wanted to run through incentives for LMI participation in a community solar array. This could be done in a variety of ways. It could be done through an existing SREC program, Solar Renewable Energy Certificate program, by offering a higher SREC rate for low-income subscribers. In Massachusetts, they have launched the SMART program, and that's basically an adder, a 6-cent adder per kilowatt hour for community solar projects that have at least 50% low-income customers. So as I mentioned earlier, if you have an incentive, it doesn't provide a cap on LMI subscribers. So That is an advantage. You could have, potentially 100% of the array be the LMI customers. And also just from the state administrative side, these can build on existing program structures so that you're not launching an entirely new program or having to create a lot of new rules and regulations. On the disadvantages, you do see LMI participation is not guaranteed. So it could be that the state or somebody else puts out this incentive and nobody actually uses it. There's no guarantee that LMI customers will participate. And it can also be a challenge to understand what level the incentive should be set at. So there's some risk that if you set it too high, the state or utility would be overspending. If you set it too low, then you don't see any participation by LMI subscribers. So figuring out that level can be challenging. The next couple topics I wanted to touch on are really focused on how programs can be designed to reduce customer turnover and default risk. And these options are really focused on components of program design that could enable LMI customers to, or developers of LMI customer programs to reduce those risks. I could not find a great example of this, but for prepaid subscriptions, that is essentially where an outside entity is providing funding for the subscriptions and the LMI customer is not paying anything. So the funding could be provided by state funds or a grant program or any other foundation or something like that really wants to just buy the customer's share up front and have those bill credits go to the LMI customer. Advantage obviously is that there's customers can't default because their payment is already made, so there's no ongoing payment in this structure. The challenges obviously are needing to find funding to pay for those subscriptions. There could be some challenges with what happens if that customer who's getting the bill credits moves out of the service territory or otherwise becomes not eligible for the program. And developers could just be slow to reassign those subscriptions. So just challenges with subscription management. A second option is having a housing authority manage the subscriptions. So some programs across the country have allowed affordable housing units essentially to be the off-taker or the subscriber of a community solar array and then pass those benefits on to their LMI tenants. So in this case, you're not having individual tenants be the subscriber, you're having that housing authority as the subscriber. An example of this is a public housing agency of St. Paul, Minnesota. They're working with Geronimo Energy to subscribe 100% of their electricity at 10 of their buildings. They're expected to save about $130,000 per year over their community solar contract. So some of the advantages here, you are eliminating virtually that possibility of customer default. In theory, I suppose the housing authority could default, but there's much lower risk there than having lots of individual off-takers participating. And there are just fewer issues with customer turnover. So the housing authority in this structure would be in charge of reassigning benefits to new tenants as they moved in. Disadvantages, primarily just that the structure really needs a way to pass through the electricity benefits from the housing authority to the tenant. And in some states and in some housing authority types, that is not possible to have that direct connection. And then lastly, just there is some administrative burden for the housing authority under this structure. They would be in charge of reassigning benefits to new tenants, in charge of handling the overall subscription and things like that. So it would create a new responsibility for housing authority staff. Another option we looked at is bundling energy assistance funds. So this is primarily focused on pairing community solar subscriptions with weatherization or energy efficiency funds. Basically, this model focuses on how you could reduce the subscription size that's needed for an LMI customer if you are weatherizing their house or their property. So in the Colorado Energy Office model, with their grant funding, they did require that the LMI participants had already had their homes weatherized or they were on the waiting list for weatherization. So that does result in a lower subscription cost for that participant, just lower bills overall. Disadvantages are that some LMI residents might not qualify for weatherization upgrades. So usually states will have certain thresholds for what types of houses they weatherize and which they don't. So for example, if their house is newer construction, it may not qualify. And then just finally, another disadvantage is that some homes might be on a long waiting list to be weatherized, and if that's the requirement that they have already had their home weatherized, then there will be a delay in community solar subscriptions. So Flex Tenant, we talked about briefly when reviewing the anchor tenant model, but essentially this is a way that a large customer, it could be a municipal government or any other type of customer that has some flexibility, they can absorb the loss of subscriptions by LMI customers who might move or drop out of the program for some other reason. And it's possible that non-anchor tenants could also serve this function. If it's just a customer that's taking 5%, they could say, I could take from 4 to 6% or something like that. And this model is being implemented in Minnesota through the Cooperative Energy Futures program. It has designed its program so that it has backup subscribers, which are, they're working with churches, mosques, and cities to cover defaults by participants. And they're saying that structure allows them to subscribe customers with lower credit scores, since they do know that they have that backup subscription. So that does reduce some risk for the developer, and it can also reduce project financing costs and reduce the cost of subscription management. Disadvantages, there still will be some need to acquire new customers, even if the Flex Tenant can, be flexible. There still may be some customer acquisition required because the flexible subscriptions are really typically bound by some preset amount. So if for some reason there were a need to go outside of those bounds, more customer acquisition will be required. Another structure we wanted to focus on is the workplace subscription program. So this is a structure where essentially the employer is facilitating subscriptions to its employees. The employer may serve as the primary off-taker, or they may just be facilitating that participation by their employees. And we do include this model since, in theory, most corporations or organizations have some LMI folks who are their employees, so it could enable those folks to participate as well. We see an example of this in Vermont. The Vermont Energy Investment Corporation developed a spin-off company, SunShares, and that company subscribes its employees to a 200 kilowatt solar array. And as I mentioned, that allows employees of all incomes to participate. So this structure does reduce risk for the developer. They do have basically a pool of employees that could be used if there are turnover issues, so that kind of ready-made backup subscriber list. And the employer could serve as a flexible tenant, as we just talked about as well. There will still be some need for, assigning new customers, and then the employer in this case would be, or could be, in charge of managing that process. So some added cost to the employer. A couple other issues I wanted to talk about briefly. This topic of customer eligibility and verification has come up. CISA has a great webinar on this topic, so I'd encourage you to tune into that for more information. But what we see typically for eligibility are a couple different criteria. The first one that appears to be the most common is income qualified. So this could be a percent of the area median income or some other threshold like that. Programs could also consider a location criteria. So that might be, if you are located in an environmentally disadvantaged area, then you're automatically qualified just based on where you live. Other programs are looking at, whether you participate in an existing program. So maybe if you are already participating in a LIHEAP or a low-income weatherization program, then you automatically qualify as an LMI subscriber. And then lastly, there are some states that allow participation by LMI housing and service organizations. So allowing those entities to serve as a subscriber can help drive down some of those customer acquisition costs and other costs. Another issue that's come up is verification. So how do you know that an LMI customer is actually low to moderate income? And the CISA webinar does go into more detail on this topic, but some states are finding ways to either qualify folks and verify them based on their participation in an existing program. Other folks are using a contractor or a third party to do that income verification and trying to streamline that process so that it's not too cumbersome for participants. Some other options that I don't want to go into detail on here, but I think are worth mentioning, that some states and programs are thinking through other, creative options that haven't been developed to date. One thing that's come up is providing some type of incentive for maintaining fully subscribed arrays. That would basically incentivize the developer or whoever is in charge of subscriptions to ensure that they're fully subscribed. Another thing that's come up is shorter subscription durations. So having LMI customers only participate for 2 to 5 years, for example, might make it easier for them to sign that contract. There's also some interest in customer default management via loan loss reserve. So a foundation or other program could create a loan loss reserve that could absorb some of that risk of customer default. And then finally, there is some work ongoing funded by the Department of Energy looking at could alternative underwriting criteria be used for LMI customers. So we know that some LMI customers either don't have a credit score or don't have a good credit score, but actually do have very high bill repayments through their utility. So there's some analysis going on to understand could that utility bill repayment be a better match for allowing LMI subscribers to be financed. So I want to touch second topic on incentives and financing. One option here is the on-bill financing method. That essentially would be an option where the community solar subscription is paid through an ongoing payment to the utility on their electricity bill. And we did see this structure through one of the Colorado Energy Office grant programs. They worked with Grand Valley Power to have a program where the fee is 2 cents per kilowatt hour, and that's subtracted from the LMI customers' bill credits that they receive. So this helps with LMI customer participation because they don't need that upfront capital to fund their subscription. They're seeing both the the bill and the credit on one document, so they don't have to worry about paying one entity and getting credits through their utility. And it can potentially increase the subscriber pool. We do see that this option could see the risk of default falling on the utility or whoever is operating that program. And if the subscription is a higher cost, then subscribers may see some higher risk for not paying their bill and being disconnected. So this could come into place if essentially the LMI subscriber couldn't pay their bill, they default on it and get disconnected. And just to note that some utility financing may be restricted by regulators, so different types of financing options would need to be approved through the PUC. A second option is just looking at lower interest rate loans. So we've seen this with the Mass Solar Loan Program in Massachusetts. It has focused on on-site solar, but could be used for community solar subscriptions. They offer an interest rate that's reduced by 1.5%. The program also pays part of the loan principal, and that varies depending on the customer's income. So advantages, obviously the customer is paying a lower interest rate, that makes the subscription more attractive, but you do need some way to structure that low interest loan and cover that subsidy cost. We do know that customers may also be resistant to signing a loan even if the rate is lower, and there is some administrative process and paperwork. So the next two slides, I wanted to talk about ways that community solar subscription costs could be reduced and how community solar development costs could be reduced. So this first slide is on how do you reduce those costs of the actual subscriptions. So one way this could be possible is through existing utility low-income bill subsidies. So many utilities have a fund where they subsidize LMI customers' bills or just write off a certain percentage or amount every year of unpaid bills. That funding could be used for LMI community solar subscriptions instead of just going to pay electricity bills. Another two options, I guess I should say, are through federal programs. I should note that no states have used these programs for community solar yet, but states are exploring their use for solar as well as community solar. Under the Federal Weatherization Assistance Program, those dollars can be used for renewable energy if the project has a savings to investment ratio of greater than 1. The costs that you can use are capped at about $3,500. So there may be some need to pair those dollars with other funding or just purchase a smaller subscription. But as I mentioned, this model has not been used for community solar yet to date. Similarly, with the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, LIHEAP, some of that funding actually goes to weatherization projects, and those dollars could be used to fund a community solar subscription instead of just paying the LMI customer's bill or using it for some other means. But we don't have an example yet of a state using this for community solar. A couple of options for reducing the project costs, So whereas in the last option we're talking about, how do you reduce the subscription costs, this is how do you reduce the cost of the array to build in the first place. So one option is through community redevelopment investments. So this is where banks can use offsite renewables to demonstrate their CRA activities. There has been some guidance saying that community solar is an acceptable way to demonstrate compliance. We do have an example of this with Alpine Bank in Colorado. They purchased 25 kilowatts from a community solar array and donated that subscription to a nonprofit organization, and that nonprofit organization then distributed credits to LMI customers. So that's a way where you could bring down the cost or have essentially no cost to LMI customers. Another option is the New Markets Tax Credit. If you are thinking of developing a community solar project in certain census tracts, it may qualify for this tax credit. We have seen this used for large solar arrays, but not community solar yet to date. Project costs can also be lowered if state budget funds are available. So this was the case with the Colorado Energy Office example. They used about $1.2 million from the state budget, and that allowed utilities to bring down the cost of their projects. You could also use multipliers on existing incentives. That could be a REC multiplier or some type of adder, and then also focus on just customer acquisition subsidies to the developer. So I know we're running to the end of our time. I do have just a few more slides on customer outreach. I'll probably run through them pretty quickly, but to start off, just to provide an overview on customer outreach challenges. We know that there are unique challenges for reaching low-income and low to moderate-income customers. There are time constraints on LMI customers. It can be hard to access them, have sufficient time to explain the program details. There can be language barriers. We also heard there can be some lack of trust, particularly if the program is providing savings from day one. It can sound like, oh, this is too good to be true, and there might be something hidden or missing from that discussion. There can also be challenges with undocumented immigrants, and just making sure that messaging towards LMI customers is targeted towards them. So some successful programs have focused on developing partnerships in order to reach LMI customers. We outlined a few of those potential partners and some of the values that they could provide by partnering. But essentially, you could work with utilities who have lists of rate subsidized customers already. So they may be able to provide a ready-made list of potential subscribers. Existing community groups that work with low to moderate income customers may already have good relationships in the community. They could help facilitate some of that educational work so that that messaging is coming from somebody they trust rather than potentially somebody new to the community. Existing LMI programs generally, they may also have lists of folks who could be eligible customers. Housing authorities, as we talked about, could serve as an off-taker and pass through the benefits to their tenants. And then solar developers generally. So solar developers do have deep expertise on customer acquisition, and some of the strategies that they use might need to be modified, but they have that experience already, so that could be helpful as well. I think I'll skip through this since we've talked through most of it, but essentially there are ways to work and reach potential LMI customers through some of these partnership programs. So looking at effective messaging strategies, this figure on the right is based on some survey work done by Pacific Consulting Group, and they were trying to figure out what are the most compelling messages? And the ones at the top really are focused on the cost piece, as well as the fact that everybody is eligible and you can get started right away. So talking through some of those things about, really the cost savings piece and that you are actually eligible were found to be the most prioritized among LMI customers or potential customers. When this study also looked at how should that messaging or communications be delivered. So this work found that messaging on a utility bill, a TV spot, and mailer were the most prioritized by potential subscribers. We also talked to some folks who are running programs and noted that social marketing may be effective and that referrals could be a good source as well. And that LMI customers, in particular, if they've already subscribed and are seeing those benefits on their bill, they can become really good advocates to their community. So just to wrap up, we've covered a lot, but just to highlight some of the key issues. So addressing those enrollment barriers, the upfront cost, length of subscription, and credit score is really important. There's some outstanding questions about how much funding or incentive levels do LMI customers need to actually participate? How do you address ongoing subscription management? And just generally, what's the role of the state in providing incentives, outreach, facilitating partnerships, and maybe even getting involved with siting of projects? Lastly, I wanted to just leave you with this design, we call it a design options menu. So there are many ways that these programs are being designed, and the top row really focuses on some key attributes of programs, and then below it's kind of a menu. So pick one from each column and develop your program design. Looks like the web page link did not show up, but if you just search for NREL LMI Solar, there's a page that we will be building out with some of the resources Laurie talked about, as well as some existing resources we have related to LMI Solar and LMI Community Solar. So with that, I will turn it back over to Diana for Q&A.
Great, thank you, Jenny. We have a lot of questions, and I'm afraid we're not going to be able to get to all of them, but we'll get to as many as we can. So first I'm going to ask, why do so few states have LMI-focused community solar policy?
Why do the states have them? Is that the question?
Why do so few states have them?
I actually think quite a few states have these kinds of policies in place, and we're seeing more and more. I think just constantly growing. So I think there's a real trend in states, trying to drive community solar, and there's a real interest across the states, I think, in trying to figure out how to provide access to solar to low-income customers, and community solar is really a compelling way to do that for just a variety of reasons, because sometimes they're renters and they just can't put it on their house and things like that. So I think there's a real trend towards more policies in this space. Did you want to comment?
Okay. What is the level of anticipated energy savings for participating LMI customers in some of these programs?
So yeah, that's a tough question. It really does vary by the program design and the type of incentive that might be available, and a lot of those, a lot of those variables. What we have heard from folks is that for an LMI subscriber, targeting at least a 10% savings is, something that then becomes attractive to those subscribers. In the Colorado Energy Office pilots, they were targeting something higher than that, more like 30 to 50%, I think. But yeah, it really does vary based on, the cost to develop the project, as well as the incentives that might be offered. So, sorry, I don't have a number for you.
Yeah, I think I'll just add to that, building on that response, that the economics vary across states quite a bit too. So of community solar projects in general, right? And so that helps also drive some potential savings, and the incentives that are available are state driven as well.
Great, thank you. Here's a question that you did address briefly. I didn't know if you would like to say a little more about it. What is the best way to assess credit for LMI off-takers, and what is a reasonable expectation for credit worthiness?
Yes, we did touch on this a little bit, but yeah, most community solar programs are using credit score as their metric. But as I mentioned, there are some research activities to try and figure out if utility bill repayment history is a better proxy or could provide access to more folks. So that's where things are at now, and I think the intention is to really investigate those other options and see whether they might be a better metric.
I know at least some programs too were evaluating whether they could use third-party vendors to help do the credit score evaluation.
Okay, great, thank you. Our next question is, do most programs have any restrictions on the location of the array? Can the array be located on a subscriber's property, or does it need to be disconnected and separately located from the subscribers?
So yeah, every state community solar program has rules around where the array needs to be located in relation to subscribers, but I don't know any, I think it's always the case that the array could be located on one customer's property. So you might see that, for example, with a large commercial customer who has rooftop space. They could put the community solar array on top of their building and also be a subscriber of that project, or they could not be a subscriber of the project. But yeah, more generally, when we see discussion of location and subscribers, it's related to how close does the subscriber need to be to the array. So do they need to be in the same county or in an adjacent county or something like that?
Yeah, I think the main examples of an array being located on a facility so far that we've seen is a housing authority.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is, one of our audience members says, it seems like a referral credit or discount would be an effective way to get new subscribers. Do any programs use a referral credit or discount?
Not that I know of offhand, but we did not fully, investigate that option. I know there has been a lot of research into, referrals for on-site solar for how, individual homes, and that has been an effective low-cost method. So I don't know whether how popular that is for community solar, but yeah, it is something that for the on-site market at least has been valuable.
It seems like from the research, the survey research that's been done, that makes it seem like that would be effective in this case, based on those results.
Okay, thank you. And I'll just say we're getting a lot of questions about whether a recording of this webinar will be available, and the answer is yes, and that everyone who is registered in the webinar will receive an email with a link to a recording. Our next question is a broad question. Of all these different subscriptions and models, which have been the most successful so far and why?
That's a great question. I think, when we started this paper, we realized that the market is pretty new, right, in this space, and that there are a lot of different designs coming out, and folks are trying lots of different things. And I think that's an indication that we don't quite know yet what the most successful design might be. And that's why in this paper we've tried to outline, some of the benefits and challenges under each structure. That said, I think, you can see Colorado has a pretty good example of how they've transitioned their programs. So they did initially have this carve-out structure where 5% of each individual array had to be from LMI customers, and there was some pushback against that structure because developers were having challenges meeting that percentage, and folks thought that a better way to do this might just be to have the utility actually manage the LMI community solar program. So we do have some lessons learned, but yeah, so many different structures right now that it can be hard to tell.
I think I'd also just add to that I'm not sure we'll converge on a single structure either. I mean, as with many things, I can see this, that there are compelling structures that, and the reasons that they're compelling can be different across states for a number of market condition reasons or other factors within the state or their incentive programs, existing ones. So I'm not sure that we're going to see, a single model emerging. We'll see, but I agree with everything Jenny just said as well.
Great, thank you. Our next question is about subsidies and who is paying for LMI participation when there are subsidies and discounts offered. I imagine in some cases we're talking about a ratepayer subsidy, and in some cases we're talking about a taxpayer subsidy, and there are probably other options as well. Would you like to discuss that briefly?
Yeah, I mean, it will depend on, a lot of different things. So there are some cases where, in the example I just mentioned in the Colorado 5% carve-out, we know that developers were basically giving away the LMI subscriptions for free, which meant that their other customers or other subscribers had to absorb those costs. So there can be some ways like that developers are figuring out how to absorb those costs overall on a project level basis. So yeah, that can be one way that those subscriptions are funded. Under other structures, if the state has an SREC bonus or something like that, that's typically ratepayer funded. Whereas if the state has just a grant program or state budget dollars, then those dollars are coming directly from the state rather than via utility ratepayers.
I think we also tried to articulate some of the programs that could potentially be used, and a couple of those are federal programs, right? So, if some areas can figure out how to use the federal weatherization assistance program or the light heat program, those are federal dollars, and the new market tax credits and Community Redevelopment Act and so forth. Those are different kinds of funds as well. So I think there's a variety of options in that space as well.
Great, thank you. And our next question, we're getting short on time here, but we're going to have one or two more questions. Can you say anything about the role of nonprofit entities like churches or temples in creating low-income community solar projects?
Those entities could have a couple different roles. They could be hosting the actual array. They could be an anchor tenant or a flexible anchor tenant. They could also help facilitate a lot of the subscription management. If they are working with LMI, the LMI population, then there could be potential for the church or synagogue to be really helping with that subscription acquisition and customer management. So I think we've seen a couple examples of that. I think there's one in DC. I won't try to remember them off the top of my head, but there have been a couple of examples of that where that sort of community-based organization is helping with subscriptions and could also host an array and be a flex tenant or anchor tenant themselves.
Yeah, I would say we've seen quite a bit of that historically. I think one of the key roles for organizations like that are the trust component. I think like reaching out to low-income customers if they have access, that it could be that they're providing information about the possibility, and they're a trusted entity, so the partnerships can be effective that way as well, because that can be one of the real challenges.
Great, thank you. I'm afraid we're just about out of time, so we're going to wrap it up there. Jenny and Laurie, do you have any final words that you want to say, or things you haven't had a chance to bring up yet that you want to mention before we close?
No, I don't think so. Thank you for the opportunity to present, and I hope it's been useful for everybody on the line.
Okay. Well, thank you very much to Jenny and Laurie and to all of you for tuning into our webinar today. And I want to apologize for not being able to get to all of the questions. There were a lot of them, so I'm glad to see that people found this so interesting. I'm going to turn things back over to Samantha for some final words.
Thanks, Diana. So I just want to let everyone know about an upcoming webinar that will be happening in mid-September. The topic for this webinar is California's pioneering policies for new homes, greater efficiency with required solar energy. So on this webinar, we will have a couple of guest speakers from the California Energy Commission. They're going to explain the new solar homes requirement in California. And there will be, like in this webinar, an opportunity to ask questions. So we encourage you to attend that. We also have several other upcoming webinars. So if you'd like to register for this webinar or see what else we've got in store, check out our website, cisa.org/webinars. Thanks, everybody. Bye.